Hey there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Little Orthodox Escaping Atheism channel. As usual, I'm your host, Max Kolbe. Joining me today is my man, Andrew Strateletes, who's also with the Escaping Atheism Project. Say hello, Andrew.
Hey, everyone.
Andrew is an Episcopalian, but a very serious, old school Orthodox one. Also joining me once again, Todd from Praise of Folly, our Mennonite friend. Say hi, Todd.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Max.
Everybody, please remember to give us a like and a subscribe right now. Go check us out on escapingatheism.com. Go check out Todd's channel too. Andrew doesn't have one. Have a channel. This is his channel, but go check out Praise of Folly. You've been doing some interesting interviews lately, by the way, Todd. I noticed the one with who was the researcher on pornography?
Judith Reisman.
Judith Reisman, yeah, that was an interesting interview, to say the least, all about Kinsey and problems in a lot of the psychology of human sexuality that's currently going as science now. It was a good interview. I recommend people check that out. But more to the point, tonight we're here to discuss the subject. We're tipping our toes into some interesting new areas here that we've never gone much into, and that is, well, we all believe in the supernatural here, but what's more traditionally, in the common, what I'd call the lowbrow culture, the supernatural is where we get into things like ghosts and, well, what do we say? Ghosts, poltergeists, and spooks, right? That's how we titled this. There's actually some, and that normally even goes into what we would call the paranormal. Now, I'm going to predict that we all have somewhat different answers here, or somewhat different takes, but I'm also going to bet that there are some surprises here. We're going to explore a number of paranormal ideas, and if people like it, we may come back for more to talk about things like UFOs. We might come up back to talk about other ideas like that. But right now, let's talk about something that people are afraid to talk about, but ghosts. Now, ghosts are not a topic that bother me at all. It used to, but I have found that, for the longest time, I simply didn't believe in them. I thought they were figments of people's imagination. I even believed the ludicrous notion that if you couldn't get a ghost on camera, then it couldn't be real. It took me a long time to bust out of that, but there is no reason to think you could very easily ever capture a spirit on a camera, or if you did, it would be under very odd or unusual circumstances. Because the classical understanding of spirit forces is that they don't work by the rules that we work under. In other words, they don't work under the laws of physics. They don't necessarily, or it's very rare. In fact, one thing that I have read that I find credible, I believe it was by a guy named Rupert Sheldrake, and then I'm going to open this up for other people to talk about. But I don't know if this was quite the right book, but I'm going to flash it anyway because it's somewhat relevant here, even if it's not the right book. He's got a lot of writing, interesting writing. Here's a book by Rupert Sheldrake called The Physics of Angels, Exploring the Realm Where Science and Spirit Meet. It's a very interesting book. Like me, Sheldrake is a former atheist. He's also a very respected and respectable scientist. He became Christian, Episcopalian, like Andrew here, actually. He chose that, although I would have to say he's, if you listen to him talk about religion much, he's serious about it, but he's a little idiosyncratic, and he's got his own quirky ideas and his own quirky take on things.
Sounds like a typical Episcopalian.
Yeah, I don't think he's a hyper-liberal, but yeah, I mean, one of the reasons he's Christian is that a Hindu talked him into it. And the Hindu said, well, you were born in a Christian nation, so that's what you should be. So that wasn't exactly the strongest motivation I ever heard. But then again, he takes it pretty seriously, I gather. And very much is a champion of the Christian faith, but he's, I don't know, like I said, kind of idiosyncratic. But he has done studies on things, and you can do this, things like angels and things like spirit forces. The book on the physics of angels is interesting is because he and a theologian and some others worked out how much of what Thomas Aquinas described as how angels would work, and showed how a lot of it matches what a theoretical quantum physics based being would look like. And of course, you'd never see such a creature. That gets to other things that Sheldrake and others have done, which is that when you survey spirit encounters of any kind worldwide, it's rather remarkable not how different that they are, but how similar they are. Ghost stories are pretty much the same everywhere around the world. I mean, the mythology or the era may change, but certain things, they've actually done what you would have to call a scientific tracking on it. For example, in spirit encounters in general, it is extremely common for not everybody present to see it. It's also not at all uncommon for some present to see it but not hear it, or for some present to hear it but not see it, and for some to get the entire show, some to get none of it. This is universal on spiritual encounter reports all over the globe and through all of history, regardless of your religious tradition. Although you'll find, you know, what I just said, you know, matches Paul and the road to Damascus and such like that, which to me is always indicated, and others indicate, okay, whatever a spirit encounter is, it's not working on the electromagnetic spectrum. It's going to be, and one of the other things, it is true, it's universally agreed on spiritual encounters. Actual physical manifestations, extraordinarily rare. They happen, but they're extremely rare. So from that basis, it's not rational to think you can debunk ghosts with cameras. You're going to be reliant on eyewitness reports. So there you go. Now, I just gave a big long wind-up and one book people can explore. You don't have to read it, but it's something to start with if you're curious. What's your take on all this, Todd?
Well, I think as Christians, one place we need to start is, given the nature of spirits, what does the Bible tell us? Now, there's some very interesting things. So as Christians, I think we would agree that spirit beings can be ordered into at least three categories: God himself, angels, and then human souls. So ghosts are typically portrayed as they're recently departed. And we seem to have indication in the scripture that that's not likely. We have the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. We have in Ecclesiastes where Solomon says that the dead are dead, right? Rather a live dog than a dead lion. But we have some interesting quotes elsewhere. We have in the book of Samuel, I think 2 Samuel, is when Saul goes to the witch of Endor to channel the spirit of Saul, or Samuel rather. And apparently Samuel comes back from beyond the grave and prophesies that Saul will be destroyed. And we also see that after Christ rose from the dead, specifically in Mark 6:49, the apostles feared that he was a ghost. So there seem to be some verses that indicate that the dead stay and the dead spirits stay dead and don't come back. But there does seem to be other verses that indicate that under unique circumstances they might be able to. And certainly the apostles, when they thought Christ was a ghost, they assumed that it was something that was plausible and a regular enough occurrence. They didn't think he was a demon. They didn't think that he was, you know, some sort of, though I think demonic forces can also explain these ghostly activities, specifically things like poltergeists. Poltergeists are a kind of ghost that is known for being very either trickster and malevolent. It'll throw things from as small as like, say, like an acorn or something, even like a chair. They'll want to trip you and bite you. And those sound like very aggressive things that you might expect a demon to do.
Now,
but
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
But another interesting theory, one that I'm not entirely convinced of, but C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce makes reference to an idea called the refrigerarium, which means refreshment. It's a Latin term. We first see it used in the Christian context with Tertullian, when he mentions that the saints in paradise are being refreshed. And it might be tongue-in-cheek, but it does seem to be a part of the tradition. C.S. Lewis argues that souls in hell are given holiday to haunt haunted houses. And then I think in most recent times, a very interesting take on ghosts can be found in the Focus on the Family radio drama series Father Gilbert, on the story entitled The Great Lady.
Hang on just a second, just in case anybody actually wants to see that. I'll splash it on the screen. Todd gave me the link. There it is. There on store.focusonthefamily.com. Father Gilbert Mysteries. You've actually got me curious here, and my wife loves mysteries, by the way.
Oh, these are great. Now, The Great Lady, though, specifically is a ghost story. And it was written by Paul McCusker, who at the time I think was still an Anglican, but has since converted to Catholicism. And he treats the ghost, it's ambiguous. It acts like a person. It has the motivations of a person that is reenacting revenge on a tragedy. But we're not quite sure if it's the recently departed dead or if it's the devil trying to masquerade as, or a demon trying to masquerade as this person. It's sort of left open for the interpreter, whether it's an actual ghost or some demonic force. But it's an interesting take on ghosts in the modern age from a Christian perspective. So I would say if there's a spectrum, some ghostly activities are probably just people seeing what they want to see. Some ghostly activities are demonic in orientation. Some ghostly activities could possibly be scientific phenomena that we have yet to adequately explain. And while it has been argued that, and we do have at least the hard example of Samuel, that a soul from Hades came back to this plane of existence. So it is possible in practice, though how likely it is, I would have no way of knowing.
All right. Well, I'm dying to weigh in on some of that, but I want to give Andrew his turn first. I'll mention these Father Gilbert Mysteries. These are audio. This is radio theater.
Yeah, this is old school radio. Yep.
Cool. I may think about picking it up from my wife just because she likes to listen to stuff in the car during her commute. That might be for her. Then she can tell me if I'd like it. Anyway, all right, cool. Well, I want to point something out. Back when I was pointing out the Rupert Sheldrake stuff, I want to tell people it's normal to go ahead and entertain the possibility that there are ghosts. It really is. If you've been beaten down by scientific naturalists and bully atheists who tell you there's no evidence for ghosts, yeah, there is. There's precious little. There's some, but there's precious little like photographic or forensic evidence you're going to take into a court. But since it has universally been known for thousands of years and globally, not just within any one religion, that spirit forces seem to be interacting with the mind, not really physically interacting with the world, it's not weird to think that they exist. In fact, the easiest way of thinking of that is that somehow they are images projected into your mind. There's nothing wrong with seeing it that way. That doesn't make them psychoses, especially when you have multiple people with the same story. Andrew, go ahead, your position.
Sure. I guess the place I'll sort of start is talk a little bit about how like the Romans and Greeks looked at the spirit world and sort of the contrast or conflict with the Christian perspective, because we get a lot of our culture from that type of milieu of certain practices and certain like folk beliefs that are thousands of years old and sort of grew up with it. Basically, that the sort of Roman and Greek way of looking at it is that the world is full of spirits, right? And some of these are malevolent and some of these are benevolent, and that humans are sort of have this soul-body dichotomy, just like we have in Christian metaphysics, and that there's some persistence after death of this. And oftentimes the philosophers like the Stoics and Aristotelians would actually make the claim that only good people have a type of spirit that is able to persist after death to a greater extent than people that are malevolent. So, and I was just going to touch on the thing that we've been sort of discussing right now is sort of malevolent activity, but there are cases where people will report either angelic beings or people people that they know have passed on, who are, for example, protecting a place or assisting people as well, which are sometimes classified as ghosts, even though their activity is very different because they're acting benevolently as opposed to malevolently. And just touching on what you were talking about, how the way we look at the spirit world is through our mind. The way that the ancient early church, especially in Egypt with the monastics, would talk about is, if you pray using the prayer of silence, or if in some like meditation techniques, what you'll notice is oftentimes there are thoughts and impressions and feelings that sort of pop up in your mind, and we don't know where they come from. And one thing that the early church said is that oftentimes these will be put there by spirits, or in that sort of sense. And the other connection is, Jung talks about like the collective unconscious, right? Or that there are symbols in this reality, sort of dream reality, that is beyond the physical. And one way to describe spiritual things, including ghosts or spirits and things like that, is in sort of this Jungian dream language, because oftentimes people will have experiences of ghosts or spirits in dreams, not only waking. And sometimes there's alignment between the things, like someone will dream about it, but someone will experience it in firsthand. So I guess those are just sort of the little anecdotes and pieces of information that I wanted to share. So.
Okay. Well, I had a few more observations I wanted to add. I always go to the science, especially because I grew up a science geek, and the world now actually over worships science and scientists, and to a great degree. But I find that a lot of people it gets through. So I want to recommend this one other video on Rupert Sheldrake and Mark Vernon on the spiritual uses of science, because it turns out that there are spiritual uses of science and scientific uses of spiritualism. For example, all that near-death experience research is in fact a type of spiritual research, and it's real research. Go look at some of that. And other people have done real studies, peer-reviewed studies on human spirituality. And again, some of the stuff I've said is just true. Ghost stories are pretty much the same around the world, and no matter where you look at them in history. And it would not be true, for example, that, Christians are going to say something is automatically false just because we didn't find it in the Bible. Well, there are very few Christians. There are some Christians who are like that. If it's not in the Bible, I just don't believe it. But that's not exactly how most people think of it. I've also found that if you just start asking people and make it clear you're not going to mock them, you're not going to doubt them or believe them, you're just going to listen, that you'd just like to know if they've ever had a ghost story. And guess what? A shocking number of people do, including a shocking number of people who are afraid to talk about it because they think they'll be mocked. And I just think that's silly. It's very common to have these encounters, and once you start asking people do have them. And one of the most offensive things about the oppressive scientific naturalist atheist view that is so endemic in the culture is that people are afraid to talk about it. They're being shut out of discussing valid experiences and told they should dismiss them as psychology, as psychological effects, as delusions. And you know what asserting that these are all just delusions is? It's psychological abuse, it's therapeutic abuse, it's pseudoscience, and it's dishonest, because there is no scientific proof that all spirit encounters of these kinds or others are simply all delusions, and it's insulting to suggest otherwise. In fact, what we should be saying is, please prove your extraordinary claim. Really? You think it's all just in people's heads and they're all deluded and hysterical? Prove that. That's a claim, and you should have to defend it. So anyway, yeah, I believe these are real. At least a lot of them are real. I otherwise thought Todd covered it perfectly. Some of these just could be people being silly. Some of these could be people who are psychologically damaged and literally delusional. Okay. Or some kind of histrionic personality looking for attention. Okay. Some of them could be exactly what they present as, and some of them could be not what they present as. Todd, you mentioned a few possibilities from the Bible, but I'm going to point out that, and there are Christian strains who will just assume that anything spiritual they encounter, be it a ghost, anything like that, must be demonic. And I do not believe that that is a fair assumption at all. It may be a safe assumption, though. Because I really should say this, and I know I've got Autumn Storm, which I interviewed, and we're real friendly with each other, but he tells me that he uses his psychic powers sometimes to talk to the dead, and I'm like, I cannot recommend people do that. That's the most dangerous thing you can do. Please don't do that. I hope he stops doing it. But I think that that is true of all these spiritual forces. For example, I could even make a case for you that fairies are real. I'm not saying I believe it, but I can make a case for it, and I don't disbelieve it. And it's on the same principles. It is not, in my view, necessary to assume that any spirit force is either of demonic origin or angelic origin. I think that's a bad assumption. There are scripture parts of the Bible that you can say would tend to lead you toward that interpretation, but there's other parts of the Bible that will lead you to a different interpretation. I think the most important take-home message is that these things are dangerous to consort with, and you don't know what they are, and you're not an expert, which means even if you do see the ghost of your dead husband, you probably shouldn't be talking to him. I mean, because you just don't know, no matter how convincing that is, that that's real. You just don't know.
Well, I think an interesting point, Max, is whether it is the ghost of the recently departed loved one, or whether it's an evil spirit. We see in Deuteronomy strong warnings against consorting with whatever these things are. They're called familiar spirits in Deuteronomy and Exodus. So whatever they actually are, because familiar spirit isn't, laid out in great detail, but there are stern warnings against consorting with those things. And of course, Saul did consort with a medium and a familiar spirit, which was actually a saint, Samuel, and it was still a bad thing for him to do, even though Samuel was a righteous man of God.
Oh, I'm sorry. In that passage, did it say that he had done wrong? Because, I mean, we had other passages, like we have Jesus going up and appearing with Elisha and...
Well, because he went to a medium, right? Samuel says, "Why did you disturb me? If God is if God has left you, why have you come to me?" Because right, Saul says, "God has not told me anything," and Samuel says, "Well, if God has left you, why are you coming here to talk to me? And why have you bothered me?" It's pretty clear Samuel's upset with this whole thing.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm remembering it now. It's been a long time since I've read that, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Even appearances of like an ancient prophet or of Jesus or Mary or any of that stuff. I mean, like within Catholic tradition, and I know the Anglicans very similar. Before you even accept that it's valid, you've got to have a whole lot of experts come and look at that. And like literally, if I said I had an apparition of Jesus appear in my local church and I had 10 people backing me up on that, if that happened, you probably wouldn't hear about it for at least a year, because everybody within the church would want to keep it silent and get a whole bunch of people in to come and talk about this, and would have warned them against talking to the press or any of that. Because the serious Christians don't want to be indulging hysterics and people with a bad agenda and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I am putting out pretty strongly to people out here who are listening, if you're a Christian, please don't be playing with this. It's not a good thing. And yes, I did have a friendly interview with a witch who I will call a friend, but I think it's very dangerous to be playing with that stuff. It just is.
Well, it's also dangerous to play with mountain lions. That doesn't mean that mountain lions don't exist or are evil per se, but
exactly. And I do want to say I'm open on this, because there's other There's passages that imply that almost anything that's not angelic is demonic, but that there's other passages that don't imply that. And there's a lot of other, I mean, there's reasons. So one of my favorite examples, even though this isn't about ghosts, it's about fairies, okay? There's an argument to be made that other intelligences may have been created by God who are neither demons nor angels. They are simply other creatures for whatever reason God has made these other creatures. We're not necessarily given to know that he hasn't done any such a thing. And we do have littered out throughout Christian history reports of saints having fairly, what you would call friendly relations. The one that comes to mind most strongly is the Joan of Arc, Saint Joan of Arc. One of the things she was put on trial for was consorting with fairies. And her answer was that yes, she was guilty. She had spoken to those fairies and made a deal with them. She had determined them to be harmless and made a deal with them so that they wouldn't bother anybody and that they would be left alone. And then she got angry when a priest went and exorcised them anyway. Now, that's a Catholic saint. Now, of course, if you think the Catholic saints are not really saints, then, whatever. But I mean, that is part of the tradition. And there's other stuff like that there could be creatures like, for example, fairies. They don't operate by normal human operations, but sometimes they become visible to some people. You can't assume they're evil, but you know what, you can't assume they're good either, and they're still not good to play with. They're dangerous.
Well, an interesting point here you mentioned earlier, Max, that there's this uniform account of ghosts. This is maybe jumping the gun a little bit. We might get into this later if we talk about aliens, but the French ufologist Jacques Vallée, who used to work for NASA, and the French scientist in Close Encounters of the Third Kind was based off him. He started looking at UFOs in a new light. He looked at them in the light of folklore, things like fairies, ghosts, even the gods of the ancient.
I've had that thought, like aliens might really just be a new iteration. Go ahead.
Yeah, but the point that he's saying is that all of these, for instance, he says that the abduction accounts are, and the structure of the events is identical to what we would see in the ancient Greek context of sort of initiation into cults. So he seems to think that all of these are the manifestation of a single group of consciousnesses that are interacting with humans in culturally relevant ways from the ancient times to the modern. And the commonality in the description, not just about ghosts and not just about UFOs, but between ghosts and UFOs, or fairies and UFOs, is that there's whatever those things are representative of a common immaterial consciousness. Rather than being multiple different entities, they're all really the same entities that are just manifesting themselves in new culturally relevant ways to interact with humans.
Or it's the same. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, or it's the same interactions they're having with us, but we're describing it in slightly different cultural language.
That too.
Well, and there's stories, you call them fairies, you call them the other folk, you call them the aliens. There's stories of people being abducted and having all kinds of weird things done to them that go back thousands of years, man. So you literally, for thousands of years, we have these reports. So I don't find it, we may do a whole thing on aliens, and maybe we are jumping the gun, but I don't find it impossible at all that aliens are just a manifestation of what may have classically been called fairies from the other world or whatever. I don't leave out the possibility that they're also aliens, by the way. But let's have that on another discussion. Let's go back to the ghost thing. There's another perspective on ghosts that's controversial, that's going to be at least somewhat controversial in Christian circles. And that gets to the idea of purgatory. Now, purgatory is a very specific Catholic term, and some take issues with the specifics of the purgatory theology as formulated by Rome, but it does turn out that something like purgatory, a state somewhere between heaven and hell, where we await final judgment, is found in most Christian traditions, in quite a few Christian traditions, let's put it to you that way, quite a few Christian traditions outside of Rome. The Eastern Orthodox, the Coptics, the Assyrians, I believe the Anglicans.
Stuff from you guys, so yeah.
It is the dominant Protestant view that there is no such thing as a place between heaven and hell.
I want to interject real quick and say that as a fundamentalist upbringing I had, the idea of the bosom of Abraham, an intermediate state, was, I believed it from as soon as I can remember. And from what I can remember, most of my people that I grew up with believed in something like that. So it might be the liberal Protestants that don't, because more fundamentalist Protestants typically do believe in an intermediate state. You know, they'll refer to the parable of Lazarus and the rich man.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I knew that some Protestants had some idea. They didn't like the term purgatory, but they still had some idea a lot like that. Some other Protestants are firmly against the idea of all and say, look, when you're dead, that is it. And then you'll be resurrected at the end of time. And that's their soteriology. It is a minority soteriology. A majority of the world's Christians, and we could show going back to the earliest church, believed there was this intermediate state between heaven and hell where you awaited final judgment. And so the ecumenical way of looking at it is that the Catholic term purgatory is a word for that broad idea. That'd be the ecumenical way of putting it. So I'm going to point out this one video I can recommend. I think people will enjoy it. It's by Ascension Presents. Now, it is a Catholic ministry, but they're very cool. They're very laid back, a lot of young people. And it is on the subject of ghosts. And he tells a terrific ghost story. So a priest telling a ghost story. Go see Ascension Presents I Ain't Afraid of No Ghosts. It's actually a great story, and believe it or not, his view was pretty close to what I think we've all said, which is, I mean, he even said he's a priest, and like, I'm not the ghost guy, so I don't know for sure. And they could be all kinds of different things, but his personal opinion was they do exist. And apparently exorcists within the Roman Catholic tradition do believe there are ghosts, and they're generally believed to be the souls of the departed. Although it is given that everybody says the same thing within the church. It's like, yeah, that might be the soul of the departed. You don't know what you're playing with. Don't go play with it, because it might not be, right? What do? You go get some help if you think it's serious. I mean, if it's a one-off thing, then you just saw something, fine. But if you're getting haunted, dude, go see a priest, talk to an exorcist. I don't care if it's from your best friend from high school. Anyway, this is a great video. I Ain't Afraid of No Ghosts, and he gives the same opinion. Mostly they're the souls of the departed. They've got some kind of business they have not taken care of, and for whatever reason they have not fully moved on to purgatory, which is where they need to be going next. That's his opinion, and he tells a great story actually about a convent that had a haunting and what they had to do about it, because apparently this convent had been haunted for over 100 years, and all the nuns there were more or less just fine with it, living with it, you know, because it wasn't a problem. But then they were starting to do renovations and reconstructions, and the ghost went nuts. And so I'll leave you to go check that story out. You'll have to go click the link after the show. I Ain't Afraid of No Ghosts, Father Mike Schmitz. Anyway, go ahead. What?
I was going to say, one thing I'd like to add is there's a friend of mine who's also a Mennonite, and he told me that there was a family that he knew. They were kind of like wishy-washy liberal Christians that were more politically activated than religiously devout. And he said that his mother participated in the processes of an exorcism. In fact, I think it was the head of his church, the bishop, that did it. But turns out that this family had a young daughter that was into occult materials like Ouija boards and a whole host of other really dangerous seance stuff. And one weekend, when that family was out, out of town for some sort of political function, they had some guy living there, to hold the house down. Some city boy is out in the country. And there was a big storm. He got spooked, and he goes to my friend's house and says, dude, I'm not going back to that house. There's some spirit in there. He said that it was a former inmate of some sort of mental asylum. Now, there's no evidence. My friend didn't know of any evidence that house had been such a place, or there had been such a building there before. But the guy was really creeped out. And I think he said he even went to the house once, and he felt something very deeply disturbing. And when they looked into the daughter's room, they found all this occult material, and they burned it and just disposed of it. And it seemed that that whatever that spirit was related to that material. Once it was destroyed and exorcised, it was clean.
The scientific naturalist will then go on to explain how this was all entirely psychological. I say don't believe them. And I would further say that I'd be thinking about doing more than just getting rid of that stuff. I'd be talking about some spiritual cleansing on that house and that room too. But I imagine they probably did something. I'm not kidding about the exorcism thing, by the way. By the way, exorcisms are making a big comeback, and I'm glad to see it. And there's Andrew, weren't you telling me about an Anglican priest who's an exorcist that you know?
Yeah, he and I follow each other on Twitter, and he's a exorcist. And there have been many articles over the past decade about how exorcism is really rapidly increasing, especially in Anglicanism in the West, and in Africa as well. But that's sort of Africans don't tend to be as spiritually blind as Westerners, so it's not as novel as it is for Westerners to be getting exorcisms again. But yeah, basically it's going up like by an order of magnitude in many Anglican places like Church of England on the east coast of the United States, where they're literally having to recruit and train more priests that specialize in exorcism, just because there are so many exorcisms being requested.
There's no reason not to get an exorcism if you're concerned about it. We're not necessarily talking about the demonic here, but the go-to advice if you're having, I mean, again, use good judgment. If you just you think you see a ghost and you have a spooky encounter once, you probably don't need to panic. But if you're getting haunted, if you're seeing things happening a lot, an exorcist is your go-to reference regardless, and you can find them. Here's an interesting article. Maybe we'll close with this. It's from a couple years ago, but it's on by a Richard Gallagher. This is in the Washington Post, even more surprisingly. He's a psychiatrist who does good business in diagnosing mental illness. And by the way, he also believes in demonic possessions, and that's part of his practice too. And he's otherwise a fully board certified and professor of clinical psychology at New York Medical College. So what this should tell you is that your scoffer friends can make as many fart noises as you want. There's plenty of scientific, rational-minded people who believe this stuff is real. And anybody who's pushing you to dismiss it all as psychological effect and automatically go to medication and psychotherapy, they're being bullies, and they're not even being scientific. I'm sorry, but they're not. They're just being ideological. I think spiritual encounters should be taken seriously. And in fact, if you have one, my advice is, if you have the urge to dismiss it and shrug it off and skeptic it away as a daydream, get skeptical of that urge, because you might be surprised at what happens when you start saying, no, I'm open to considering something spiritual just happened there. And I think people should, and I'm not saying every experience is a good one. Stephanie Thomason, who I may get on here again one day, came back to Christ after she had a demonic encounter. So, but not every encounter is going to seem obviously evil. Just be careful. But yeah,
if I could end on something,
anything you see is demonic just because it's spiritual either. Don't panic. Just be careful what you're playing with. Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, I just want to say to wrap up my end of it is this idea, this sort of, as you pointed out, Max, this materialist conceit that, for 80% of recorded human history, most human beings were either liars or hallucinating or extremely gullible, is such a conceited and offensive idea. It's like people that are super intelligent, people like, Plato or Herodotus or Marco Polo, would have described things that we would consider very odd, but to call them insane or liars or hallucinating is just an insult to good judgment. And I think the attitude,
stupid. Yeah, that they were all just rock stupid.
Yeah. And then I think the attitude of Jacques Vallée is very important. He says that these experiences, these phenomena, are real phenomena that are occurring. Now, as to what is causing them And what we can conclude from that is an open-ended question. But men of science and learning should look at these as actual occurring phenomena, and that people are describing something that's not just happening in their mind, like some sort of crazy person, but something they've actually experienced, and then trying to get to the bottom of what that is. I think it's a very healthy way to look at it, rather than the more dismissive, atheist, materialist cult that Max has been mentioning.
Oh yeah. Oh man, I've seen some of these guys. There was an old episode of Joe Rogan with T.J. Kirk, the amazing atheist, on there, where he clearly described demonic and ghostly encounters, and tried to explain it all away as electrochemical effects in his brain. And I'm like, dude, and he's just spouting pseudoscience to explain this away. I'm like, dude, oh man. But anyway, okay. Final thoughts, Andrew.
Oh, yeah, that there is a reality beyond just the physical, and that it's spiritual, and we get trained and indoctrinated, especially in the West, to ignore or dismiss it, which actually leads us into error, logical error about how reality works. So yeah, I think that's my closing thought.
Logical error, scientific error, honestly, and dangerous error. Not that I suspect that everybody needs an exorcist. Okay, I don't think that, but completely closing yourself to the spiritual completely. I'm sorry, people talk like Hindus are primitive, but Hindus are more intelligent than that. And I think if you look at mental illness, Hindus, Shintoists, whatever, but pick the other religious tradition, they're not as stupid as atheists are on this. If you look at people with mental illness and all the people on drugs who've accepted this atheist naturalist view of the universe where nothing works outside of physics, may account for a lot of the mental illness we have, because people have closed themselves to the spiritual. And so they're needing to fix things because they've broken all sorts of stuff by simply ignoring and dismissing all the evidence for the spiritual. Okay, I guess that's enough, everybody. Once again, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us again, Todd, especially. Be sure to check out his channel, Praise of Folly, and check out his excellent interviews there. Also, please give us a like. Please give us a subscribe. Look for us on escapingatheism.com, and look forward to our upcoming Little Orthodox project too. All right, everybody, God bless.